This is Kaitlyn St. Charles, and Kaitlyn is finishing up her master's degree and also a member of our team. She's a risk analyst, and she's been with our team since 2017. As part of her undergraduate and graduate education, she conducted research in the areas of meat science, epidemiology, and animal welfare. On our secure food system team, Kaitlyn contributes to the risk assessments, a big chunk of the writing, and she's done poultry, swine, and aquaculture commodities, assessing risk associated to foreign animal diseases such as highly pathogenic avian influenza, African swine fever virus, and viral hemorrhagic septicemia. Kaitlyn, I forgot I have this big number 4 for when you're ready.
Okay.
And we'll take it away. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, hopefully that's good. All right, thanks, Marie. So let's just jump right into things then, and we're going to be discussing a very applied example of what Mickey was just talking about, the results of our African swine fever boar semen risk assessment. So to provide a brief introduction of the project, today we'll be discussing the results of a proactive risk assessment that was really done to inform continuity of business activities during an African swine fever outbreak. So we're really looking to assess the risk of moving boar semen from a control area during an ASF outbreak. This work was funded by National Pork Board, a SHIC, a USDA NEFA, as well as part of our USDA SIA cooperative agreement. Work began on this project in earnest in 2020 with the first completed draft of the risk assessment really now in preparation. So as the title suggests, the risk assessment evaluates the risk for the specific product movement of boar semen out of a high-risk area, so an ASF control area. And again, we're specifically talking about during an African swine fever outbreak, right? So we're being very specific with the product movement we're looking at. It's coming from a high-risk area, and we're talking about the specific movement of boar semen would result in the spread with susceptible animals on site. And answering that question is incredibly important when we think about really what happens to farms that are caught up in these foreign animal disease control areas. So just to provide some context, if there is an ASF control area set up, say we detect this virus on a farm and we establish that 10 kilometers around an infected farm, any farms caught up in that 10-kilometer radius, they'll be issued a hold order, right? So meaning they cannot just continue business as usual. All movements of product off of that farm will be halted. So in the case of a boar stud, we can't just move semen as we were prior to the setting up of that control area. So in continuity of business permit. And so what does this entail, right, in terms of this permit? So what's important? As we just noted, we'll switch it up. Here, I'll pass that to you. Oh, geez. Oof. There you go. I'll just hold this. All right, so what's important when it comes to these permits, right? So as we just noted, permits are required if we want to move product out of a control area. If a farm wants to move products off their farm and they're in a control area, they need this permit. It's issued by a state animal health authority. It's only valid for a limited amount of time, and the permit request is submitted through the online EMRS portal. And lastly, the permit requires that specific movement criteria are met. So farms need to do specific things before they have that permit. They need to agree that they'll be doing things. So what exactly does this movement criteria entail? So movement criteria, as far as what farms need to do to move out of foreign animal disease control areas, they're generally outlined in a permit guidance document. Mickey alluded to this a little bit when she was answering questions. And so the criteria that's outlined in these guidance documents includes things like, product-specific biosecurity, transport mitigation, so truck and driver biosecurity, as well as commodity-specific pre-movement testing requirements. And here is where risk assessment plays a very important role. So through product and pathogen-specific science-based risk assessment, we can really determine appropriate and evidence-based permit guidance, aka that movement guidance that is needed to get that permit so we can safely move product out of a control area. So in summary, risk assessment serves this very important role, right? So we're assessing the risk of specific products out of control area with these science-based methods. We're developing pathogen-targeted, commodity-targeted biosecurity and efficacious pre-movement testing and surveillance that inform the permit guidance. And ultimately, we are seeking to safely maintain continuity of business during an outbreak, right? So we want to move product without spreading disease. So where do we start then when we wish to do a risk assessment? How do we want to assess the risk of a product? So using WOA risk analysis methodology, as Mickey was alluding to, our team builds a risk assessment using the following component parts, right? So firstly, we want to set the context of the risk assessment as well as figure out ways that we can simplify the analysis. Again, all farms are different, and so we want to ensure that variation is mitigated or contained. So we set up the scope and assumptions as well as characterize the commodity of focus in these first two sections. Next, we're summarizing what is known in the literature regarding the pathogen we're concerned with, so in this case, ASF. Then the meat of the risk assessment is really this entry assessment as well as an exposure assessment. So with our entry assessment, we're describing the biological pathways needed for ASF to enter the environments where semen is produced and when it's transported. And then the exposure assessment, we're describing the pathways of virus in order to reach and expose susceptible animals on different farms, so outside of that control area or to other farms within it. Within each of these assessments, we are estimating the descriptive likelihood. Mickey put on the screen, though, that the range of likelihood ratings and risk ratings. We're estimating those descriptive likelihoods for virus entry and exposure, and all of these component parts are then integrated in tandem with our consequence of the move to determine that overall risk rating. So if we dive deeper into our specific risk assessment and looking at the virus entry into the environments we're concerned with, we see three key likelihoods that we really need to address that inform this scenario. So these likelihoods include what is the likelihood that ASF virus enters the stud, resulting in one, infection of the resident boars as well that are producing semen, as well as contamination of the product that we're trying to move as well. And then additionally thinking about what is the likelihood that semen products could be contaminated during their transport. So the likelihood that virus enters that transport environment as well. So now if we assume there was successful entry, if we now assume that the virus entered the stud and we have infected but undetected boars on site, now we look at the pathways necessary for virus to successfully move off of this stud and expose susceptible animals. So here we start at the boar stud and consider what is the likelihood, one, that if we have infected but undetected animals, what's the likelihood we couldn't detect those animals and we couldn't detect virus positive semen prior to shipment of that semen off the farm, as well as thinking about what is the likelihood that virus shed by infected but undetected boars on site could contaminate semen produced by uninfected animals on site, either in the barn, so in the warm-up or collection area, or in the lab. If we end up moving infectious but undetected product, now we're looking at our destination premise. So we need to consider, what is the likelihood that insemination with semen that is infectious but undetected could successfully result in transmission of ASF via insemination, as well as thinking about, what's the likelihood that the fomites and mechanical vectors accompanying the semen in that movement, the likelihood that those components too could spread ASF to destination sites. So jumping in with a little more detail of what this process entails to evaluate these likelihoods, we use this multi-step process. It appears very linear here, but in practice it ends up being quite iterative. But at a basic level, we start by understanding how the virus behaves based on current literature. We fully characterize the environment we're concerned with, so including knowing how operations are on our origin sites, understanding the biosecurity that is in place at our origin and destination premises that's very commodity specific. We review additional standardized biosecurity programs that may exist, such as SPS, our secure pork supply, if folks are enrolled in that and it's being used during an outbreak. And then from here, we either will take this path of doing a qualitative pathway analysis, or we could take the route of a quantitative analysis. If we want to do a qualitative pathway analysis, we will then construct disease transmission pathways that are relevant to the likelihood statements pertinent to our entry and exposure assessments. Then we will look to evaluate the efficacy of the mitigations that are currently done or that are feasible in relation to each pathway step, right? So, and then finally, we'll descriptively synthesize these results from the pathway analysis to understand really how well is that pathway mitigated. If we approached these likelihood statements, answering these likelihoods with a quantitative approach, which we do in some cases, this is really built around a disease transmission model specific to the pathogen we're focused on. From there, we can evaluate different active surveillance protocols and determine quantitative probabilities of detection of virus. Again, as Mickey was alluding to, we have a lot of stakeholders involved in this process, and a critical piece in the success is working with our risk assessments public-private work group. So again, it contains folks from industry, commodity groups, industry associations, private companies. We're working with veterinarians, producers, as well as the regulators, both state and federal, and then folks from academia, extension, subject matter experts who really bring a lot to the table with these discussions. So the work group is central to characterizing how the product we're focused on is produced, processed, packaged, transported. They're key in helping us set the scope of the risk assessment, as well as if we want to do the entry and exposure pathways, we really couldn't build those without the working knowledge of our work group and their technical expertise. And additionally, this work group, as Mickey was saying, really helps us to determine what's feasible during an outbreak. What can we do to layer on additional mitigations if we look at likelihood ratings and we're seeing them that they're not acceptable to us, they're too high. So with the help of the work group throughout this process, the descriptive likelihood ratings are determined. From here, we work in collaboration with our work group and discuss how acceptable these ratings are and if additional mitigations need to be put in place. Again, Mickey did a great job explaining what acceptable likelihood or risk really entails. So knowing how we determine these likelihood ratings, then let's jump into some of the results of our entry assessment. So as is described a few slides back, the entry assessment is comprised of these 3 likelihoods, which we evaluated qualitatively. We qualitatively evaluated 13 separate pathways when assessing the likelihood of entry resulting in infected resident animals. These include pathways, related to possible distance-independent links between farms, as well as local area spread components. We also collaborated with the USDA SIA to determine this likelihood based on a quantitative between premises disease spread model as well. However, we won't really go over those results in this talk. Our collaborators will be presenting those results independently at future venues and talks. As far as the likelihood of semen contamination with virus originating from outside of the stud, a lot of the entry pathways included, personnel, supplies bringing virus onto the farm, into the collection area where it might interact with semen, or into the lab. And then additionally, we would look at the capacity of, semen extender ingredients to bring virus into the farm and subsequently contaminate semen. And then finally, looking at the likelihood of semen contamination during transport, we're also considering, variation that exists if we're using private couriers who are company employed or third-party commercial couriers as well. So again, in the previous talk, Mickey did a great job with her Swiss cheese analysis example, explaining how the layering of different biosecurity can really substantially impact the likelihood of virus introduction and spread. So we don't really need to spend too much time explaining this here, other than noting that within our qualitative analyses, the efficacy of these different layers of biosecurity are considered, and they're assigned their own likelihood ratings. So considering that all of the layers of biosecurity are in place during an outbreak, so this column on the right here, where we have industry standard in place, we have secure pork in place, as well as these targeted mitigations that were determined by the work group and determined via gap analysis during our qualitative analysis. we can see that the likelihood of virus entry into environments we're concerned with really ranges from negligible to low, which is great to see. Additionally, the high degree of biosecurity that is already in place on boar studs because they have genetics they're trying to preserve and they can impact a lot of farms. We can see that their industry standard biosecurity is efficacious if we're looking at just the likelihood of virus entry with only that biosecurity layer in place. So moving to the exposure assessment, the 3 likelihoods that inform exposure that were assessed qualitatively include the following, and with their pathways pretty similar to the entry assessment, when we're thinking about contamination now, but with virus from boars that are already in the stud, we're thinking about personnel and supplies acting as mechanical vectors and fomites. Now we're thinking about, aerosol spread within the barn itself. Similarly, with our contamination likelihoods and pathways, we're thinking about now how those couriers could actually spread virus to other farms versus how those couriers could contaminate the semen itself. And so another piece here also in the exposure assessment that's a bit different, we need to consider the capacity to which sows and gilts could successfully become infected if inseminated with infectious but undetected semen produced by a boar or if it's contaminated. So here we relied on key literature, such as Friedrichs et al. 2022 that was recently published, and we're really framing many of the key findings from such studies within the context of what surveillance protocols that we've determined, as well as what mitigations are in place. So reviewing the results of our qualitative analyses within the exposure assessment, the likelihood of successful exposure and the steps that it needs to go through to reach the animals, for the most part, falls within this negligible to moderate range. We see negligible to very low, negligible to low in certain cases. We also have a likelihood the rating that's kind of under revision here. We looked at this with our work group. The original ratings kind of contained a lot of uncertainty within them, especially as it related to critical virus transfer steps as things are moving through. And the work group decided that we really wanted to review that chapter thoroughly and dedicate discussions to determine additional mitigations and bring that likelihood down and reduce uncertainty. So it's honestly a great demonstration of how pivotal the work group is to our process. So let's discuss then where the surveillance protocols are derived from. Those surveillance protocols do impact the likelihood ratings, especially in exposure. And so a key piece of where these surveillance protocols are coming from is looking at the likelihood of not detecting virus-positive semen before it's moved off of a farm to a sow farm. So again, we're utilizing quantitative methods that we discussed a couple slides back in 15 and 17, and we're using a heterogeneous disease transmission model to evaluate the efficacy of different active surveillance protocols, specifically the impact of detection based on changes in certain parameters. So these parameters include, stud size, the timing of diagnostic sample collection in relation to semen collection, the number of semen collection days per week that's occurring on a stud, the proportions of donor boars being tested at one time, as well as the implementation of a pre-movement isolation period or no implementation of that. So based on model outputs, the most efficacious surveillance protocol was determined. With that baseline protocol, assuming we are taking specific diagnostic sample types as well as using specific tests, we're assuming that all dead and sick boars are tested daily. We are also assuming that all donor boars are being tested on the day of collection. And again, we're assuming a 5-day PMIP is implemented for that first move of semen off of a farm in a control area. So this protocol was shown to be, if we assume this protocol is in place, the likelihood that we would not detect virus-positive semen before moving semen off the farm is low. And we have the quantitative probability of collecting virus semen from at least one infected boar to go along with this. If we start changing this baseline protocol, so changing the timing of when we're testing in relation to semen collection or the proportion of boars that we're testing during collection, we start to see that likelihood come up to a moderate rating. So now we know the likelihood of African swine fever virus entry into a stud and the transport environments is ranging from negligible to low. We also know that the likelihood that susceptible animals become exposed and are successfully infected with ASF, it ranges from negligible to moderate. Now we want to look at that, as Mickey was saying, in tandem with the consequence of our move, right? So we didn't perform a formal consequence assessment within this risk assessment. It was a bit outside of the scope. You know, we weren't looking at the economic impact of if we're moving infected but undetected semen. But working with the work group and kind of validating some assumptions, we just assume the rating to be high. And this is based on what we know about ASF's ability to infect sows through semen produced by infected boars. It's also just related to, you know, the nature of how quickly and to what scale sows and gilts would become exposed to virus, just based on how the product of semen is used and where it's moving to. And so with the likelihoods of entry and exposure and thinking about the magnitude of that consequence of movement, we qualitatively estimated that the risk that the movements of liquid-cooled boar semen from a boar stud in a control area would successfully spread ASF to other farms. We rated this as low to moderate. But this is with the caveat that we are assuming that key biosecurity is in place, all of those layers of mitigations are in place, and that the baseline continuity of business surveillance protocols are being followed, and that semen is not moving from the stud until all test results are known. So with our preliminary risk rating in mind, we've determined this. What are the next steps for the risk assessment itself? So we are hoping to incorporate relatively soon the results from the quantitative analysis that our partners at USDA-SIA have determined for likelihood of entry. And then we'll be citing the risk assessment through a multi-step review process, right? So we're kind of deep in the process of having our work group review specific chapters. Additionally, once we have a completed draft, we'll have our internal executive team review the risk assessment, the completed risk assessment, and then we'll have an independent review with subject matter experts who are not a part of our work group, but they are experts in areas that are relevant to key areas in the risk assessment. And then finally, we'll have a full review and a clearance provision by USDA-SIA. Upon completion of this risk assessment, the final document will be available on multiple websites. So Secure Pork will house it, as well as our own Secure Food Systems team will house it, and it'll be published officially on the Digital Conservancy at the University of Minnesota. Additionally, we'll do some targeted webinars about specific results to certain stakeholders as is needed, and then we'll provide, you know, general risk assessment results in industry newsletters and things like that. So kind of basic dissemination there. So finally, as we described in the beginning of the presentation, the results of the risk assessment will be used to provide targeted recommendations that can help improve the current USDA draft of the boar semen permit guidance, specifically as it relates to baseline testing protocols. So those pre-movement testing protocols, we know how efficacious certain surveillance protocols are now, as well as we'll recommend product-specific biosecurity too. And with that, thank you everyone who is in attendance. Appreciate you guys being here, and we'd like to provide a huge thank you to our work group members. They are, again, really, really central to our process, and we couldn't do the work we do without them, without their working knowledge. And then thank you to our funders who have provided us the opportunity to do this work in the first place. So thank you so much.
We're going to switch. That'll be the speaker mic. Thank you. We have time for questions for Kaitlyn. Here's a question.
Good morning.
Morning.
My question is, how often do you, or what's the frequency of your assessment activities? Do you update them, or in your perspective, what would be the ideal frequency?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. As far as updating it, I mean, especially with ASF, like related research is constantly being published, right? So we will use the most current data available to us, publish the risk assessment. It'll be housed on the different websites, but then we do plan to update it pretty frequently, right? And that also kind of depends on funding too. As Mickey was saying, you know, these risk assessments can be multiple hundreds of pages, and it takes time and effort to go in and revise based on what's being published. So ideally, you know, it could be something like yearly. After you have outbreaks, you learn a lot from those experiences. So ideally, after an outbreak, you would want to be updating this as well based on, you know, epidemiological findings, things about how the virus behaves. So a great question we don't have the perfect answer to, but, you know, maybe yearly or something like that if we have funding to do so.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. There is a push by the National Pork Board to update the secure pork supply, which is the biosecurity checklist and the things necessary for producers to do that biosecurity. And as part of that, they would review the risk assessments at that time. And so they're trying to get on the regular schedule for that. But it's important to update it as information becomes available. So that's why the academics are involved, because we're always looking for new information. John.
If we get into a long-term recovery program, say we've had an outbreak, and we know that boar studs do a lot of PRRS testing for
Yeah.
semen.
Yep.
Is there an opportunity to integrate, say, ASF surveillance with PRRS testing so that we have an integrated one-stop testing program for boar studs, or are the requirements going to differ so much between the two viruses that that's not possible?
Yeah, good question. I'll pass it to the swine vet here to answer that.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to clarify on this is when we're talking about the testing is on the donor boar, not on his semen. And two, so since blood is possible, when with serum it's blood, or sorry, with PRRS it's blood or serum, but they're DNA and RNA extractions, but there are new test kits out there that'll extract all of it, and then you can send it on its different way for the pathogens. So that would be the ideal, is all the high consequence diseases in one. But I'm not in the diagnostic lab anymore or in the development side, but that would be a possibility. Certainly the sample could be shared. And Dennis has a question.
Mine is also a follow-up to some of the discussion that has been had here. So what is the final output from this work is generally a recommendation, and the challenge comes in when it comes to compliance and enforcement. Now we know that the US swine industry pretty much is liberal. They like their own space. Could you comment on how to ensure that everybody at least follows some of the recommendations that are coming from this work?
I'll take that one. Yeah, that's a great question, because, you know, we're not regulators. We're not putting together policy. This isn't policy. This is guidance, again, recommendations. So one thing is we've done this type of work a lot in the poultry arena, right? So dealing with AI and things like that. Regulators have regularly used our permit guidances on the poultry side of things. And just when there's an outbreak and people want to stay in business and they have skin in the game, there's a pretty big incentive to be following not just to comply to get your permit and appease regulators, but also just to ensure that you're not becoming infected, you're staying negative, and that you can keep moving product. So if you start slipping up on that compliance and then you end up becoming infected, or you infect another premise in your company system, something like that, there's pretty big consequences. And so there's a lot of incentive for compliance. But yeah, again, it's a really good point. This isn't necessarily policy that we can enforce. We're just academics. So